She saved his daughter from silence, yet no one knew she had once buried her own child. When a grieving billionaire hires a mysterious nanny, love begins to heal old until a cruel whisper from the past threatens to destroy the fragile family they've just begun to build. What was she hiding, and why was she really there? Before we dive into this unforgettable journey, tell us in the comments, where are you watching from? If stories about love, sacrifice, and second chances speak to your heart, hit that subscribe button, because tomorrow we're bringing you another powerful story you won't want to miss. The job posting was short, almost clinical. Live-in caretaker for 6-year-old girl, must be discreet, must have experience with trauma. No name, no photo, just a location. Sterling Hill, estate. Ellie Reyes stood outside the estate's wrought iron gates, suitcase in one hand, Raisin tucked neatly inside her purse. Her brown hair was pinned back, her gray coat buttoned to the neck despite the heat. She looked composed, too composed for someone who had nowhere else to go. Behind her calmness lived a truth she didn't let the world see. The gates creaked open. A security guard nodded her through without a word. The path curved past manicured hedges and stone fountains, up to a looming mansion framed by skeletal trees. The sky above was gray, as if it too was holding its breath. Inside, she was met by Mrs. Hadley, the housekeeper. Older, with silver hair tied in a low bun and eyes that didn't miss much. "Mr. Sterling is waiting," she said, "but don't expect a warm welcome." Ellie simply nodded, clutching the strap of her bag. She followed the woman through silent hallways, past oil portraits and glass cases of antique books. The house was stunning, but hollow, like a museum after closing hours. In the study, Graham Sterling stood by the window, his back turned. The light caught the sharp line of his jaw, the gray at his temples, the weariness in his stance. He didn't look at Ellie when she entered. "Ogle early," he said without turning. "I was nearby," Ellie replied, her voice even, "and early is better than late." That made him turn. His eyes were a piercing steel blue, narrowed and scanning, like he was trying to solve her before she said another word. He was tall, broad-shouldered, handsome in a haunted kind of way. But nothing about him felt approachable. "You've worked with children before," he said, glancing at the resume she'd submitted. "Several families, mostly in private care settings. And trauma?" he asked sharply. "This isn't just about making lunch and reading bedtime stories." "I understand trauma," Ellie said, her voice softer now. "Not just professionally." He looked at her for a long moment, as if weighing that answer. "She hasn't spoken in 10 months, he finally said, "since the funeral." Ellie's breath caught. "I'm sorry." He didn't reply. Instead, he motioned to the door. "Mrs. Hadley will show you to her room. Lila's in the garden. See if she wants to come inside. She won't talk, but she's watching, always watching." Ellie followed Mrs. Hadley through more corridors until they reached the back of the house. Beyond the glass doors lay a quiet garden, wisteria crawling up trellises and sunlight filtering through tall hedges. Lila sat on a stone bench, cradling a sketch pad. Her dark curls hung over her face, and her small fingers gripped a colored pencil. Ellie didn't speak. She just walked to a nearby bench, pulled a notepad from her own bag, and began to draw. After a few moments, Lila's eyes lifted. Ellie looked up, smiled, and resumed sketching. A bird, then a flower. She turned the pad slightly so Lila could see. Slowly, Lila turned her sketch pad around. On it was a matching flower. That was the beginning. Later that evening, Ellie prepared her own tea in the quiet kitchen. She heard heavy footsteps pacing above her. Graham. She could almost picture him in his study, glass of scotch in one hand, eyes on the framed wedding portrait she'd seen earlier on his desk. Ellie stood at the sink, tea untouched, the ache in her chest growing tighter. Not just for the grieving man upstairs, but for her own story one she'd vowed never to. The job wasn't just a fresh start. It was a second chance. The days that followed settled into a rhythm Ellie hadn't expected. The Sterling estate remained cold and still, but inside the nursery, music played softly, colored pencils scattered across the floor, and Lila slowly began to bloom without words, but with color and gesture. Ellie taught by instinct. When Lila wouldn't speak, she gave her ways to express herself through drawings, songs hummed quietly, or the soothing repetition of nursery rhymes. Sometimes, Ellie would sit beside her in complete silence, letting the little girl feel safe simply by not being forced to speak. In the quiet, they formed a bond that went deeper than most words could reach. At meals, Graham remained distant. He ate methodically, read reports from his tablet, rarely looking up unless Lila dropped something or Ellie asked a direct question. Ellie noticed, though, that he always lingered a moment longer outside the nursery door at night. He never entered, but he listened. One morning, Ellie found a single rose in a glass jar, waiting on the breakfast counter. No note, no explanation. She smiled faintly, but said nothing. Graham saw the smile as he entered the kitchen, dressed sharply as always. "She picked it," he said curtly. "Out back." Ellie turned, surprised. "Lila?" He gave a slight nod. "She used to pick them with..." The air grew heavy for a moment. Then Ellie nodded. "It's beautiful." Graham cleared his throat. "I've arranged for her therapist to return next week. It's standard." "I understand," Ellie said, her voice gentle, "but if she's not ready, it might set her back." He frowned. "She can't remain mute forever." "But if you don't," Ellie said. "Not if we listen instead of push." For a moment, Graham's eyes flashed something defensive, maybe guilt. Then it was gone. That evening, after Lila was asleep and the house grew still again, Ellie found herself wandering the hallway near the east wing, a part of the mansion she hadn't yet explored. She stopped in front of a door slightly ajar. Inside, light flickered. She pushed it open gently. It was a music room. Dust blanketed the edges of the grand piano, though someone had recently wiped the keys clean. Sheet music sat half-played. A violin rested on its stand, untouched. Ellie stepped inside slowly. The scent of old wood and memory filled the space. "You used to play here?" Graham's voice said behind her. She turned to find him standing in the doorway, arms crossed. "You I thought." He nodded. "Every night after Lila fell asleep. I haven't touched a note since she died." Ellie walked over to the piano and sat. She ran her fingers softly over the ivory keys but didn't press them. "Music doesn't die with people," she said. "It waits." He studied her carefully. "Why are you really here, Miss Reyes?" She looked up, held his gaze. "To care for your daughter, to remind her that even in silence, she's heard." His jaw tightened. "You speak like someone who's lived through loss." Ellie didn't flinch. "I have." But she said nothing more, not yet. He left quietly. Later that night, in her small room tucked in the back wing, Ellie sat on the edge of her bed and pulled a folded photograph from her satchel. It was worn at the corners, faded from too much handling. A boy, no older than 5, with eyes like hers and a crooked grin. She ran a thumb along the edge, holding her breath. She whispered, "Good night, my love," before tucking the photo back beneath her pillow. Downstairs, in the dimly lit study, Graham stared again at the wedding portrait. His hand hovered near the frame, but he didn't touch it. 2 people, 1 house, both mourning different ghosts. And a child who, without saying a single word, had already begun to bring them back to life. Ellie quickly learned that the Sterling mansion had a life of its own. It creaked with old wood and whispered through its vents. The chandeliers above barely flickered when the wind moved through the upper levels. Some nights, the house groaned like it remembered joy, and now ached in its absence. Other nights, it simply watched. She had been at the estate for almost 2 weeks, and while Graham remained emotionally out of reach, Lila had begun to change. She still hadn't spoken a word, but her eyes followed Ellie with less fear. Her little feet padded across the nursery floor more freely, and she began to hum 2 low notes, especially when she colored. Ellie never interrupted. She just listened, sometimes humming along, letting the child know she was safe to feel without explanation. One afternoon, after a rainstorm had passed and golden light spilled through the tall windows, Ellie sat on the floor beside Lila, helping her untangle a string of wooden beads. The child suddenly placed her hand on Ellie's wrist and rested her cheek there for a brief, silent moment. Then she picked up her sketchpad again. It was a gesture Ellie would never forget. Later that evening, while clearing away the plates from a quiet dinner, Mrs. Hadley stopped beside Ellie at the sink. "You know," she said, drying her hands on a towel, "you're not the first nanny who's come through here." Ellie raised an eyebrow but said nothing. "You're the first one who lasted this long," the housekeeper continued. "Most of them were gone within days, couldn't stand the silence. Or him." Ellie nodded slowly. "I understand silence." Hadley gave her a long, knowing look. "I believe you do." That night, Ellie went to the study to return one of Lila's books Graham had lent her. The room was empty, dimly lit by a single lamp on the desk. She moved to place the book gently on the edge when her eyes landed on a newspaper clipping, tucked between two files. A name in the headline froze her. She stared at the words, blood draining from her face. The photo beside the article, an old one, showed a crowded courtroom, blurred faces, and in the corner, unmistakably, her own. The headline read, "Child disappearance still unresolved. Custody battle turns tragic." Ellie gasped, stumbling backward. Her hand gripped the edge of the desk as her chest tightened. The air in the room seemed to collapse. She forced herself to leave quickly, her heels barely making a sound on the hardwood. Back in her room, she locked the door, dropped to her knees beside the dresser, and pulled out the bottom drawer. Inside, she retrieved a folded letter, the last one she had ever received from her sister. It was yellowed at the edges, the handwriting smudged from time and touch. She read only the first line before her vision blurred. Then she struck a match. The letter burned in the ceramic bowl she kept by the window, slowly, silently, until all that remained was ash and the ache of memory. But she didn't burn the photo. She kept that hidden beneath her undergarments in the drawer. A little boy with dimples and the brightest smile, a smile that used to chase the shadows from her heart. She curled into bed that night, heart pounding against the silence, unsure if she had made the right choice by staying. The next morning, she found Graham in the conservatory, sipping black coffee, staring at the glass wall of roses blooming just beyond the panes. His voice was unusually low. "Did you sleep?" Ellie met his eyes. "Restless night." He nodded, not prying, but his gaze lingered. And for the first time, Ellie felt the walls around him weren't just cold. They were protective. Built not to keep people out, but to keep something broken. The days that followed carried a quiet rhythm. Ellie walked Lila through the garden maze, the child holding her sketchbook close as if it were armor. Together they fed the koi in the stone pond, baked simple cookies in the massive but underused kitchen, and read stories beneath the warmth of stained glass windows. Lila began reaching for Ellie's hand on her own, and Ellie allowed herself to savor those fleeting touches. Still, the mansion whispered. Ellie often caught herself turning toward faint echoes. Music from nowhere, a creaking door, left ajar. The staff said nothing, but their glances spoke of years tiptoeing around grief. Mrs. Hadley would hum a lullaby only to cut it short. The butler, Charles, walked the halls like a man afraid to disturb ghosts. Ellie understood that kind of hush, not just the absence of noise, but the presence of sorrow too heavy to speak. One rainy afternoon, Lila handed Ellie a crayon drawing. It showed 3 stick figures, one tall, with dark scribbles for hair, one smaller in a red dress, and a third, short, with golden curls and a sun drawn behind her. Ellie traced the drawing gently. "Is this you?" Lila nodded once. "And this?" The child pointed to the taller figure. Ellie hesitated. "And who's this one with the sun?" Lila didn't answer. She simply touched Ellie's hand and walked away, leaving Ellie with a question she didn't dare voice aloud. That night, Ellie ventured to the East Wing, an area she hadn't explored. As she passed a series of oil portraits, one caught her breath. It was a painting of a woman, stunning and sorrowful, wearing a pale blue dress and holding a music box. A brass plaque beneath read, "Margot Sterling, beloved wife and mother." Ellie stared at the painting far longer than she intended. Something in Margot's eyes mirrored her own reflection. Not just beauty, but pain, cloaked in composure. She turned to leave when she heard footsteps. Graham stood at the end of the hall, arms crossed. His expression was unreadable. "You found her," he said quietly. Ellie took a step back. "I didn't mean to intrude." He shook his head. "You didn't?" Silence stretched between them. "She was everything this house used to be," he murmured. "Music, light, laughter. After she died, it all stopped." "I'm sorry," Ellie said softly. Graham looked at her, his eyes lingering on her face as if searching for something he couldn't name. She loved the East Wing. That piano in the parlor used to echo through every wall. "Lila still hears it," Ellie whispered. His gaze flickered. "She hums melodies I don't recognize," she continued. "On ones I don't think came from me." A muscle in his jaw twitched. Maybe. Some sounds are hard to silence. Ellie didn't sleep that night. The fire crackled in her room, but she felt cold to the bone. She dreamed of a child running through woods, her name being called over and over, a broken voice whispering, "Don't let go." She woke up with tears on her cheeks and the photo of the boy pressed against her heart, though she didn't remember pulling it out. The next morning, Graham watched Ellie from across the breakfast table. His coffee sat untouched. "You ever going to tell me why your hands shake when you read the paper?" he asked suddenly. Ellie froze. He didn't say it with cruelty, but with a sharpness that made her realize he had noticed more than she thought. She steadied her hands on the tablecloth and met his gaze. "When you're ready to tell me what you see in that photo on your mantel every night," she said, "I'll tell you why I keep one hidden in my drawer." For a moment, his expression broke. Just a flicker. Then he nodded once. An unspoken truth passed between them. Two broken people, not yet ready to explain their scars, but willing to see each other silent. The morning sun poured gently into the Sterling Estates breakfast nook, casting long, golden streaks across the polished oak table. Lila sat with her coloring book, crayons scattered like a small rainbow. Ellie, seated beside her, hummed softly, an old lullaby. Lila's hand paused mid-doodle. Her little lips moved, barely parting as if testing a word before releasing it into the world. Then, in the faintest whisper, it came. Ellie froze. She turned slowly, heart racing. "Lila? What did you say?" Lila looked up, eyes wide and unsure, but not afraid. She repeated it, this time a little louder. Tears welled instantly in Ellie's eyes. She reached over and gently touched Lila's hand. "That's beautiful, sweetheart, so beautiful." Behind them, a sharp intake of breath broke the moment. Graham stood in the doorway, his face pale, shoulders rigid. He didn't speak, just looked at his daughter, as if seeing her for the first time in years. Lila met his gaze, hesitant, then reached. "Daddy," she whispered, and that crumbled whatever wall Graham had left. He sank to his knees, enveloping her in his arms. His voice cracked. "I've missed you so much." Ellie watched silently, her heart aching, not with envy but with a quiet, aching recognition. After a few moments she turned to give them space, but as she walked toward the kitchen, Graham's voice stopped her. She turned. He looked at her, tears still in his eyes. "Stay." Later that evening, after Lila had gone to bed, Graham found Ellie outside on the back porch. The air was cool, the sky painted in soft shades of indigo. Ellie sat curled up in one of the rocking chairs, sipping tea she hadn't touched. "You did something no doctor or therapist could," Graham said, sitting beside her. She spoke. "You brought her back." Ellie gave a sad smile. She was never lost, just waiting. He looked at her carefully. "How did you know what to say, how to reach her?" Ellie took a long breath. "I've been quiet too, sometimes silence feels safer." Graham nodded. "I haven't really slept since my wife died. Every sound in this house used to echo with her absence." "I know that kind of quiet," Ellie whispered. He studied her face in the dim light. "Do you have family?" She hesitated, fingers tightening around the cup. "I lost someone too." Graham didn't push. They sat in silence, the kind that spoke louder than words. For the first time, It wasn't awkward. It was peaceful. The next morning, something was different. Graham joined them for breakfast. It wasn't much. He sipped his coffee and read the newspaper. But he was there, not locked in his study, not hiding behind grief. Just present. Ellie glanced at him across the table as Lila chattered softly about her latest drawing. He offered a small smile. She returned it. That afternoon, Ellie and Lila danced barefoot in the living room, spinning in circles to soft piano music. Graham leaned quietly against the doorframe, unnoticed. He watched Ellie lift Lila into the air, both of them laughing freely. A warmth stirred in him. Not romantic yet, but real, genuine. But just as things began to bloom, a chill returned. In the evening, Graham summoned Ellie to his office. His expression was unreadable. "I made a few calls today," he said, voice even. "I couldn't verify your references. Some of the institutions you listed said they've never heard of you." Ellie's face paled. Graham continued, "I need to ask, who are you? Really?" She stood frozen for a moment, then quietly replied, "I'm not dangerous, Graham, just broken." There was silence. She added, "But if you want me to leave, I understand." He didn't speak immediately. Finally, he said, "No more secrets, Ellie." Then he turned away, but didn't dismiss her. She left the room with trembling hands, unsure if she was still welcome or just on borrowed time. Ellie closed the door to Graham's study behind her, her pulse pounding in her ears. The hallway felt longer than usual, darker somehow. Her footsteps echoed off the marble floors, and she wondered if this was the beginning of the end. "No more secrets," he had said. But what if the truth was too much? What if he found out everything? She returned to her room and sat at the edge of the bed, her hands trembling in her lap. In the drawer, the photo remained. A worn image of a boy, no more than 5, with curly brown hair and a grin so wide it stretched beyond the frame. Ellie touched the corner of the picture, her eyes misting. No one had called her Mama in over 4 years. That night, she barely slept. Every sound outside made her flinch. She wasn't afraid of being discovered by strangers. She was afraid of being known by someone who had finally started to matter. The next day, Graham said nothing about their conversation. He remained courteous, observant, almost reserved again. But he didn't fire her, and he certainly didn't treat her like a threat. That was worse in some ways. The waiting, the uncertainty. Then something shifted. While Ellie was helping Lila gather leaves in the garden for a craft project, Graham stepped outside, hands in his pocket. "Ellie," he said, not unkindly, "walk with me." She hesitated, then nodded. Lila waved him off happily, returning to her pile of leaves. They strolled along the garden path, the crisp autumn breeze rustling through the trees. "I meant what I said," Graham began. "No more secrets, but I also meant what I didn't say." Ellie glanced at him. "Which is?" "You're still here." She swallowed hard. "I've seen enough of this world to know when someone's running," he said, "and I've seen enough of you to know you're not running toward danger, you're running from something painful." Ellie looked away, blinking back tears. "I never meant to bring trouble here. I just needed a place to exist." He stopped walking and turned to face her. "You're more than your past, and Lila?" She's laughing again. She's sleeping through the night. "That's you, Ellie. Whatever you're hiding, I won't dig it up unless I have to. But I want you to know, this house, this family, you've made a mark." She didn't know what to say. Her throat tightened, and for a moment all she could do was nod. Back in the house, the atmosphere seemed to lift slightly. The staff greeted Ellie with warmer smiles. Graham lingered longer at dinner. Lila climbed into Ellie's lap during story time and stayed there, nestled and safe. Still, the uncertainty gnawed at Ellie in quiet moments. One evening, after tucking Lila into bed, she found Graham seated alone in the music room. The fire cast dancing shadows across his face. "I lost my wife to cancer," he said suddenly. Lila was 3. She doesn't remember much, just music and bedtime stories. Ellie sat beside him in silence. "I was angry for a long time," he said, "at the doctors, at the world, at myself. She listened quietly, watching the flames reflect in his eyes. "Then you showed up," he added, and for the first time, this place didn't feel like a mausoleum. Ellie took a breath, steadying herself. "I don't know how long I'll be able to stay. Because when people learn who I used to be, they usually want me gone." He looked at her, his expression soft. "Then maybe it's time they see who you are now." And for the first time since arriving at the estate, Ellie allowed herself to believe she might have a future. One not defined by the past, but by the small, healing moments unfolding in the present. The invitation came folded neatly beside Ellie's teacup one morning, slipped there without announcement. Handwritten, simple and formal. "Saturday Gala, Saturday evening. You're invited as a guest." She stared at the card, then looked up at Graham, who stood quietly in the doorway of the kitchen, arms crossed, a slight crease between his brows. "It's just a thank you," he said almost gruffly. "You've done more for Lila than any of us could." Ellie hesitated. "I don't exactly fit in at galas." Graham shrugged. "Neither do I." That evening, Ellie pulled out the only formal dress she owned, a black satin piece with sleeves just long enough to make her feel safe, modest but graceful. When she stepped out into the grand hallway, heels clicking softly on the wood, Graham turned, and for a moment, his breath visibly caught. He didn't say anything at first, then, clearing his throat, "You look beautiful." Ellie blushed. "You don't clean up too badly yourself." Graham gave a soft smile, rare and fleeting, and offered her his arm. "Shall we?" The gala was held in a glittering hall downtown, marble floors, chandeliers dripping with crystal, and guests adorned in gowns that sparkled like stars. Graham introduced her only as Ellie Reyes, nothing more, and stayed close throughout the evening. When they danced, it was cautious at first, his hand at her waist, hers resting lightly on his shoulder, the space between them small but pulsing with something unspoken. Around them, whispers began. "Who is she?" "She's too young to be just the nanny." "I heard she's living at the estate." Ellie tried to ignore the murmurs, but her skin felt too tight, her smile too still. She kept her eyes on Graham, trying to anchor herself in the moment. Then came the voice that split the illusion. "Eleanor?" A man, mid-40s, sharp eyes, sharp suit, and a memory that hadn't dulled. Ellie froze, the color drained from her face. "You used to volunteer at Westbridge Shelter, right?" he continued, voice just loud enough for nearby guests to hear. "Back when, well, before the incident?" Graham turned sharply. "What incident?" Ellie's throat constricted. Her hands began to tremble. The man's smirk widened. "You didn't tell him? About your arrest? About the kid?" The silence was instant and heavy. Ellie turned without a word and fled. Inside, the cold air bit at her skin as she stumbled toward the curb, heels wobbling, breath hitching. She felt like she was drowning in invisible shame, dragged backward into a past she'd never escaped. She didn't hear the door open behind her, but she felt Graham's presence before he spoke. She turned around, face wet with tears. "Don't, please, just go back in." His voice was quiet. "Why didn't you tell me?" Her chest rose and fell rapidly. "Because no one ever wants to hear the truth. They just want a version they can judge." He looked like he wanted to say more, but he didn't. He simply stood there, torn between disbelief and something softer, something broken. Ellie didn't wait for permission. She walked into the night. Back at the estate, Lila waited, curled up on the couch with her sketchbook. When Ellie didn't return, she clutched the drawing she'd made and carried it upstairs to Graham's study. It was a picture of Ellie, smiling, arms wide like wings, with tiny stars surrounding her head. At the bottom, in Lila's careful scrawl, "Ain't." Graham stared at it for a long time. Later, when the house was still, he opened Ellie's bedroom door. It wasn't locked. Inside, everything was neat, except the drawer. A corner of paper stuck out, blackened with ash. He pulled it gently. What remained of a letter? Next to it, a photo. A young boy with sad eyes and a gap-toothed smile. Graham sank into the chair beside her bed, the photo trembling in his hand. He didn't know who the boy was, but he knew he mattered. Graham sat in the dark for hours, the photograph heavy between his fingers. The boy's face looked hauntingly familiar, though he couldn't place why. There was a scar under the left eye, barely healed, a date scribbled on the back, 7 years ago. He looked again at the drawer, hoping for something, anything more. But the rest of the letter was burnt, only edges and a few scattered words surviving. Wasn't my fault. I tried. Never stopped loving him. The clock ticked into the early morning. Outside, the trees swayed gently in the wind, as if whispering truths no one dared say aloud. By dawn, Graham made his way down to the kitchen, where the housekeeper was already steeping tea. She looked up, surprised to see him so early. "She's not back, is she?" he asked softly. The woman shook her head. She always walked the garden path when she was upset. Graham stepped outside and followed the gravel path that curled around the estate. Dew clung to the grass, and the air smelled like wet earth and pine. Near the edge of the orchard, where Lila and Ellie had once gathered apples, he found a handkerchief, half buried in the soil. He picked it up. Embroidered in the corner were the initials ER. She hadn't gone far when she ran, he realized, just far enough to feel alone. Back inside, Lila waited at the breakfast table, her drawing clutched tightly in her small hands. Her lower lip quivered when she saw her father enter alone. "Where's Ellie?" she asked in a whisper. Graham knelt beside her, heart constricting. "She had to go somewhere last night." Olivia sighed. "I will," she said. "I know, sweetheart," he said, brushing her hair back, "but I think she just got scared." Lila's voice was soft but certain. "She's not bad, Daddy. She sings to the flowers when no one's looking." He blinked. "She does." Lila nodded. "And sometimes she cries when she thinks I'm asleep, but she always tucks me in, every night." Graham's throat tightened. He remembered how long it had been since Lila laughed. Since she'd spoken, Ellie had done what he couldn't. She'd brought his daughter back. Later that day, Graham asked the estate's tech manager to dig into public databases, not out of suspicion, but out of need. He wanted the full story now. He had to understand. The records came back within hours. Ellie Reyes, volunteer youth counselor. No criminal record, no official arrest, but one incident flagged in a child welfare database. A custody battle gone wrong. A boy named Leo, age 6, removed from her care by an anonymous report of negligence. Later deemed unfounded, but too late. The boy had disappeared from the system. Presumed adopted. There were no further updates. Graham closed the file, hands trembling. Ellie hadn't been hiding a crime. She'd been living with the aftermath of losing someone she loved. Someone no one fought for. Someone who might have been her son. He looked again at the photograph. The resemblance was unmistakable. That night, Graham entered Ellie's room once more. He placed the photo carefully on her pillow, beside the angel sketch Lila had left. Then he picked up the phone and called the only private investigator he trusted. "Find Ellie Reyes," he said. "I don't care how long it takes." He ended the call and stood in the doorway of the empty room, the silence pressing in. He missed her laugh, her calm presence, the way she soothed Lila with a single lullaby. The dinner had changed everything, not because of scandal, but because it tore down the last of his walls. Now, all that was left was truth, and the hope that it wasn't too late to bring her back. The memory came back like a flood she could no longer hold back. Ellie sat on the edge of her bed, the burned edges of the letter curled inside the drawer beside her, and the photo of the little boy tucked safely beneath her pillow, untouched, unburned, 'cause she couldn't bear to destroy it. In that photo, Leo's grin was wide, 2 missing teeth on the bottom, his hair wild from the wind, and his arms wrapped tightly around her waist. It was taken just weeks before the accident that shattered everything. Before the courtroom cameras. Before the headlines. Before the shame swallowed her whole. She had been 23, too young, they said, too reckless. The night of the crash, she had been driving back from a job interview. Leo had begged to come, not wanting to be left behind again. She had buckled him into the back seat, handed him a juice box, kissed his forehead. It had started raining. The truck came out of nowhere. She remembered the sound of metal folding, glass shattering, her scream. And silence. She lived. Leo didn't. She remembered the cold hospital light when they told her. The nurse touching her arm, the police officer standing at the door. The questions, the suspicion, the quiet nods exchanged over her file. There were no criminal charges, but the media dragged her anyway. Young mother's negligence, one headline had read. Another, where was the seatbelt? They didn't know that Leo had unbuckled himself to grab his toy. No one wanted the truth. The grief was unbearable, the guilt unlivable. She disappeared, changed her name, took jobs that wouldn't ask questions, and for years she simply survived. Until Lila. Until that tiny, quiet girl who looked up at her like she was safe. Until the first time Lila held her hand and didn't flinch. Until the moment she whispered, "Mama," and Ellie felt her heart rip open again, in the best and worst ways. Now Graham stood in the doorway, silent, holding the photo he had found. He didn't say anything at first, he just looked at it, then at her, then back again. Ellie didn't hide, she didn't lie. Her voice was steady as she said, "His name was Leo. He was 6, just like Lila." Graham walked slowly to the chair across from her and sat. The photo trembled slightly in his fingers. "I read about the accident," he said softly. "Of course you did," she replied. "Everyone did. But you made you into something you're not." Ellie said, "I let them. I disappeared because I couldn't live with what I lost. Not just Leo, but who I used to be." There was a long pause. Graham's voice broke slightly. "You know, after my wife died, people asked me how I was holding up. All the time. But no one ever really wanted to know. They wanted the performance of grief. Not the truth." Ellie looked up, tears in her eyes. "The truth is messy. And real." She gave a shaky smile. "You think you're the first person I've told this to?" "I don't care about being first," he said. "I just care that you're not carrying it alone anymore." Her throat tightened. She wanted to say something, anything, but instead, she just let herself cry. Quietly, steadily, not in shame, but in relief. Graham stood and handed her the photo. "You don't have to hide this anymore. He mattered. He still does." She pressed it to her chest, breath hitching. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "Don't be," he said. "You did what you had to, and somehow, even through all that, you became someone who helps others feel safe again." Ellie couldn't believe it. After all the years running, someone had finally said the words she didn't know she needed. That she was still worthy. The next morning, the household felt different. Not because anything had changed on the surface. Break was still laid out neatly. The light from the east window still poured across the tile floor, but something unspoken now flowed between Ellie and Graham. A thread of understanding. A recognition that went deeper than grief. Lila climbed into Ellie's lap without hesitation, her tiny fingers curling into the fabric of Ellie's sweater as they listened to the birds outside. "She drew you again," Graham said as he entered, holding up another page from Lila's sketchbook. This time, the angel had a name scrawled beside it in crooked crayon. "Ellie." Ellie blinked, then smiled, brushing a tear from her cheek. "She gives me too much credit," Logan said, sitting beside them. "She sees what I see." Later that day, whispers stirred among the staff. Someone had leaked Ellie's name to a media contact. An anonymous source claimed to know her past, claiming she'd used a new identity to infiltrate a vulnerable household. The article was already making the rounds on gossip blogs. Graham found out quickly. He called an emergency meeting with his executive board. A few members, concerned about optics, suggested Ellie resign, quietly and respectfully. One even accused her of manipulating the situation for sympathy. Graham stood at the head of the table, calm but cold. "Anyone who believes this woman doesn't belong in my home or in my daughter's life can consider their employment here over." The room fell silent. "She saved Lila," he continued. "She brought light into a house that had gone dark. I trust her with what matters more than any of your board votes, my child. If anyone leaks another word, I won't hesitate to take legal action." He left the room before they could respond. Downstairs, Ellie sat in the sunroom with Lila, unaware of the storm brewing above. She was tracing letters in a workbook, helping Lila form words one sound at a time. Every so often she'd humor him, softly saying "Logan, so lonely" to him. When Graham returned, he said nothing about the meeting. Instead, he walked over and gently set down a paper beside her. "What's this?" she asked. "Formal recommendation to our foundation's board to start a program in Leo's name, one for children navigating trauma. A music and art therapy wing." Ellie's hand flew to her mouth. "It's yours, if you want it." She stared at him, heart thudding. "You would do that for me?" "I'd do it for the boy who should still be here, and for the woman who's kept his memory alive in every gentle thing she's done since." Ellie didn't answer, not with words. She stood, walked to him, and wrapped her arms around his waist, pressing her face into his chest. For a moment, he simply held her, his hand running through her hair, his chin resting on her head. No questions, no expectations. Only acceptance. That night, as the house settled into silence, Ellie took the photo of Leo and placed it on her bedside table, not hidden, not folded away in shame. In the hallway, Graham lingered by the nursery door. Lila was asleep, clutching her favorite stuffed bear. He looked back at Elliot's closed door, his expression softening. There was still a long road ahead, but they weren't walking it alone anymore. In this house built by grief, healing had begun to bloom. Ellie stood in the kitchen, her hands trembling around a chipped teacup as her phone buzzed nonstop on the counter. She hadn't looked at the headlines, but she didn't need to. The storm had broken. Her past, every word she tried to bury, were now being devoured by the world. Graham entered, his face grim. He said nothing at first, simply walked over and gently turned off the buzzing phone. "I saw," Ellie whispered, her voice thin as paper. "They've printed everything. Tabloids twist what they want," Graham said firmly. "They think pain makes you entertainment." Ellie gave a bitter laugh, sharp and hollow. "I gave them the script. I ran, Graham. I changed my name. I let the world think I was guilty." "You weren't," he said, his tone low and unwavering. But she wasn't so sure. Later that afternoon, Lila didn't come home from school. The silence in the mansion was suffocating. The call came an hour later from Child Protective Services. "She's safe," they assured, "but given the media attention and allegations, we've taken her in for precautionary questioning." Ellie dropped to her knees. "They took her because of me." Graham was already moving, calling lawyers, demanding answers, coordinating a response. His hands were shaking, but his voice was steel. By that evening, he'd arranged for a statement. The press gathered outside the estate, hungry for scandal, desperate for blood. Graham stood before them, Ellie behind the curtain of the window, watching through the slats. "My name is Graham Sterling," he began. "You all know that. What you don't know is that I have spent the last 2 years learning how to survive grief. And in that time, I met a woman who helped my daughter speak again, who helped me live again." He paused. Cameras flashed. "You may know Ellie Reyes by the name she once abandoned in a moment of unimaginable loss. But what I know her as is the woman who saved our family." The crowd murmured. Graham's jaw tightened. "We don't exile the broken. We fight for them." Back inside the house, Ellis's chest heaved as tears spilled from her eyes. The next morning, a package arrived addressed to Ellie. Inside was a handwritten letter. It was from the mother of the young man who had been driving the car that killed Leo. The note was delicate, shaking in script. "We never had the courage to come forward, but the truth is, my son confessed, he ran a red light. It wasn't your fault. It never was. We are so sorry for letting you suffer alone." Ellie's vision blurred. She clutched the paper to her chest as sobs racked her body. Graham entered quietly and sat beside her. He didn't ask questions. He didn't try to soothe her with empty words. He just wrapped his arms around her and let her cry into his shoulder. Years of shame, grief, and silence breaking all at once. "First one now," she asked, voice cracking. "Why did it take this long to be seen?" "Because the world moves fast," he whispered. But love waits. It waits and stays, and finally finds its voice. They sat like that until the light changed in the windows. That evening, the door creaked open. Little feet padded across the floor. Lila stood in the hallway, still wearing her pink backpack, eyes wide and searching. "Ellie," she said, voice small but clear. Ellie turned, her tears not yet dry. Lila ran into her arms and clung tightly. Then, for the first time, she said the words that would change everything. "Ellie, mama?" Ellie couldn't breathe for a moment. The word echoed in her ears, soft, unsure, but real. "Ellie, mother." Lila buried her face in Ellie's neck, arms wrapped tightly around her. Graham stood nearby, silent, eyes glistening as he watched the girl who had barely spoken a word for months offer the most unexpected, pure gift. Ellie held Lila close, blinking through a blur of tears. She didn't know how long they stayed like that, but it didn't matter. For the first time in years, she felt more than sorrow. She felt chosen. Later, they sat together on the front steps of the estate, as the last of the day's light settled over the trees. Lila was curled in Ellie's lap, drawing shapes with her finger on Ellie's hand. "I thought they were going to take you away," the little girl said. Ellie kissed her forehead. "No one's taking me away, not now." Graham sat beside them. "I won't let them. I've made that clear." And the moment was tender, but heavy. The world hadn't stopped turning, and Ellie knew that more questions would come. More headlines, more eyes. But something had changed. The weight wasn't hers to carry alone anymore. The next morning, Graham gathered his executive team. Some protested his defense of Ellie, warning about brand image and shareholder concern. Graham stood at the head of the boardroom table and laid down a file. The official CPS closure notice, the cleared statement from the police, and the letter from the family of the real driver. "She's innocent," he said calmly. "And if any of you leak another word to the press, you won't just be fired, you'll be held legally accountable." One advisor muttered, "There's still perception to consider." Graham narrowed his eyes. "Then maybe it's time we stop caring what perception demands and start caring about truth." Back at the estate, Ellie walked into the music room. Lila's drawings were taped on the wall. Crayon portraits of the three of them, stick figures holding hands beneath rainbows and suns. She sat at the piano, unsure, and began to play a simple melody, a lullaby Leo had loved. Her fingers hesitated over the keys, but the memory of his laughter had nothing but comfort then. Alone or on a date, Leo wrote the name of his lover, guided her. Graham appeared in the doorway, listening. "You played that before," he said softly. "It was my son's favorite," she whispered. He stepped closer, kneeling beside her. "Thank you, Hieronymus, for staying." She looked at him. "There was nowhere else I wanted to be." He reached for her hand. "Losing someone doesn't mean we're broken beyond repair. Sometimes it just means we need more time and the right people." Ellie leaned into him, resting her forehead against his. "You gave me a place to be more than my past." "No one hears you created that place. For Lila, for me, for yourself." They stayed like that for a while, the melody lingering in the air like a memory, or maybe a promise. By the end of the week, public opinion had shifted. Graham's speech was shared across social media, praised for its compassion and strength. Parents wrote in support. Survivors of loss shared their stories. Ellie didn't return to hiding. She walked through the estate gardens holding Lila's hand, nodding politely to staff who now looked at her with quiet admiration. She was no longer a shadow in the house. She was part of it. One evening, as stars blinked awake overhead, Lila looked up and asked, "Are you staying forever?" Ellie smiled. "If you'll have me?" Lila nodded, her grip tightening. "Forever's not scary with you." Graham stood behind them, hands in his pockets, watching the two people who had saved him more than he'd ever admit. "We're not broken," he murmured again. "Just healing." The sun hung low over the horizon, casting a golden path across the quiet beach. Soft waves lapped at the shore as Ellie held Lila's tiny hand, their footprints trailing behind them in the wet sand. The air was cool, salted by the sea, and the moment felt like something from a life Ellie never believed she could have. Graham had chosen this place deliberately. Private, serene, untouched by reporters or board members. Just them. He watched the two of them ahead, Ellie in a flowing linen dress and Lila in her favorite seashell breakfast sandwich overalls. Something in his chest loosened every time he saw them together. The sound of Lila's laughter, the freedom in Ellie's smile, it made the mansion of silence feel like a distant memory. After dinner, a picnic of grilled fish and roasted vegetables they'd cooked together. Ellie sat near the fire Graham had built on the sand. Lila had already fallen asleep, curled in a blanket, her head resting on Ellie's lap. The stars above were brighter here, clearer. Ellie tilted her head back to see them, though part of her still worthy of it. Graham sat down beside her. He didn't speak for a while, letting the night do the talking. Then, he pulled a folded envelope from his jacket pocket. The paper was slightly worn, as though it had been read many times. He handed it to her without a word. Ellie looked at him, brows furrowed. "What's this?" Graham swallowed. "A letter. From Clara. She wrote it a few weeks before she passed. I wasn't ready to read it until you." Her hands trembled slightly as she opened the envelope. Inside was a single page, Clara's handwriting, elegant and deliberate. "Dear Graham, if you're reading this, then I'm no longer with you, and that thought breaks my heart in more ways than I can express. But I need you to promise me something. Promise me you won't let my shadow dim your light. Life doesn't end with loss, it changes. You still have so much love to give, and Lila deserves to grow up watching you find joy again. Let someone in. Let someone love you, and let yourself love back. Always yours, Clara." Tears blurred Ellie's vision as she finished. She pressed the letter to her chest, breath shaky. "She sounds like someone I would have loved," Ellie whispered. "She would have loved you too," Graham replied, his voice barely audible above the waves. Ellie looked down at Lila's peaceful face, then back to Graham. "Do you really think people get more than one love in a lifetime?" "I think some of us are lucky enough to be loved more than once, and brave enough to accept it," he said, reaching for her hand. He didn't kiss her that night. Instead, he held her hand under the starlight, their fingers interlaced as the fire crackled between them. It was quieter than a kiss, but just as intimate, more a vow than a gesture. The next morning, a low ran along the shoreline collecting seashells. Ellie watched her, heart full. Graham approached with 2 cups of coffee and a folder tucked under his arm. She raised an eyebrow. "Business, even here?" He grinned. "Just one thing." He handed her the folder. Inside was an official offer from the Sterling Foundation. Director of Community Engagement. Full salary, full trust. Ellie blinked at the page. This is huge." Graham nodded. "You've done more for our family and our community than I can explain. You deserve this. And only have one condition," she said, smiling softly. "With that, I still get to do bedtime stories with Lila." Graham chuckled, relief and admiration in his eyes. "Then it's a deal." That evening, back at the beach house, Ellie walked onto the back deck, where Graham stood gazing at the sea. The moonlight silvered his hair and softened the edge of his usual composure. He turned as she approached, offering her the seat beside him. They sat in silence at first, the kind that felt full rather than empty. Ellie held a mug of warm tea between her palms, breathing in the calm. "Keep thinking," she said, breaking the stillness. "How different my life would have been if someone had told me, back then, that I was still worth saving." Graham turned to her, his gaze steady. "You are..." She looked down. "I used to believe I'd never deserve another chance. That grief defined me. That I'd always be the woman who failed her child." Excuse the pun? "You didn't fail," Graham said gently. "You survived, and you've given Lila something she hadn't had in a long time. Hope." Ellie's voice trembled. "And what about you?" "I was buried beside Clara for a long time," he admitted. "But you, Ellie, you didn't just pull me out. You reminded me how to breathe again." Her eyes welled with tears, not the sharp, painful kind, but warm and slow, like the melting of winter. She leaned into him, head resting on his shoulder, and for a while, they just listened to the tide roll in and out. The next morning, Lila bounced into Ellie's room, clutching a drawing. "Look," she exclaimed, her voice brighter than ever. "It's us, you, me, and Daddy and Angel Clara, up in the sky." Ellie looked at the drawing, her throat tight. Lila had drawn them holding hands beneath a sun, Clara floating gently in the clouds with a peaceful smile. The innocence of it both shattered and healed her at once. Later that week, they returned to the estate. Graham's staff greeted Ellie not just as an employee, but as someone who belonged. Whispers had faded, scandal had been replaced with admiration. After the foundation held its annual fall gathering soon after, Ellie was the guest of honor, not because of her past, but because of her strength. She gave a speech, nervous, raw, but honest, about rebuilding life after loss and how love doesn't vanish with tragedy. When she stepped down from the podium, Graham took her hand and didn't let go. Not once, not in front of hundreds. The next morning, Ellie walked through the community center they were building, a new project she would oversee. Rooms were filled with books, art supplies, and space for children to grow, laugh, heal. It wasn't just a job, it was a purpose. That night, she stood at Lila's door with a book in hand. Lila was already tucked in, hugging a stuffed fox. "Story time?" Ellie asked with a smile. Lila nodded and patted the space beside her. As Ellie began to read, Graham leaned against the doorway, watching them. For a moment, he didn't say anything. Then, in a low voice, he said, "I've been thinking about Clara's letter again." Ellie paused, looking up. "What about it?" "She asked me not to let her shadow stop someone else's light," he said. "And the truth is, you're the light." Her breath caught. "I don't know if I'm ready to believe that." He stepped forward, crouched beside the bed, and took her hand. "Then let me believe it for you. Until you can?" Lila looked up at both of them, beaming. "Does this mean you're going to stay forever?" Explained smiled, tears in her eyes. "If that's okay with you." "Forever sounds perfect," Graham whispered. The sun poured like honey across the estate lawn, golden and warm, the way childhood memories are. Lila's laughter rang out like wind chimes, chasing butterflies in a white dress, her tiny feet skipping through the grass. Ella stood beside the long picnic blanket, adjusting plates of lemonade and tiny sandwiches with careful hands. She glanced toward the tree line where Graham was setting up the kite they promised to fly today. He looked relaxed for once. The tension of years slowly evaporated. Ellie sat on the blanket, watching Lila play. Her heart swelled with a feeling she didn't have a name for, something that blended gratitude, healing, and disbelief. She was no longer the woman haunted by a courtroom, a lost name, or a buried past. She was here, present, loved. When Graham walked over, he knelt instead of sitting. Ellie gave a soft laugh. "You're going to ruin your pants." He only smiled and reached into his pocket. Her breath caught when he held out a small velvet box. The world seemed to pause. "Because you're perfect," Graham began, voice low and steady. "But because you stayed. You stayed when it was hard, when it hurt. You helped us breathe again." Tears brimmed in Ellie's eyes, but she don't blink them away. "Eyes," she whispered before he could even open the box. "1,000 times, yes." Graham laughed, relieved and emotional all at once. He placed the ring on her finger. It was simple, a delicate gold band with a stone the color of Lila's eyes. The wedding was small, quiet, and wrapped in the kind of intimacy that felt sacred. No grandeur, no photographers, just the people who mattered. A few of Graham's most trusted friends. The housekeeper, who had once worn Ellie the mansion swallowed the kind-hearted, and Lila, sweet, brave Lila, who walked down the aisle first carrying a small bouquet and wearing a smile that could light galaxies. Ellie's dress was soft ivory, made from borrowed silk. Graham wore no tie, just a pressed shirt and the expression of a man who had finally found his peace. They exchanged vows beneath the cherry tree, now in full bloom, the petals drifting around them like confetti from the sky. Afterward, during the reception set under fairy lights, Ellie stood to speak. Graham watched her with a look that didn't need translation. "Stories," Ellie said, her voice gentle but certain, "begin in pain. Ours began in silence, a broken little girl, a grieving man, and me, a ghost of the woman I used to be. But somehow, through music and sketches and laughter, our silence bloomed into hope. She looked at Lila, who was curled up in a blanket at the edge of the dance floor. And sometimes, love doesn't arrive like a storm. Sometimes it grows in gardens, one petal at a time. After the final dance, Lila ran into Ellie's arms and buried her face in her dress. "Mommy," she murmured sleepily, "can we stay like this forever?" Ellie cradled her, tears falling into Lila's hair. "Forever," she whispered, "and longer." Graham took Ellie's hand. Together, they watched Lila run into the open field of flowers behind the house, her laughter chasing the wind, their future unfolding in the golden dusk. And finally, they were home, at last.